Welcome back, everyone, for the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. A lot's been going on for the last few weeks. I'm starting to compile a lot of that. In the meantime, we're going to go into a lot of what's happened. We have some rules, some of the college basketball rule changes, so we'll go over some of that. Rosters are largely starting to come into play, so we'll also dive into that. And then also we have the NBA draft is only a couple of weeks away. So we'll also dive into the guys who stayed in the draft and what that's going to look like as we move forward. Before we get started, though, I want to just remind everybody that there are a couple of solo interviews that are on the podcast page, on the YouTube page. Check those out. We have associate head coach from St. Mary's, Justin Joyner, and then also USF head coach Chris Gerlefsen. So go check out those interviews. They're on the page right now. And all right, so we'll dive into it. So I think we'll start with the roster constructions, and because we largely now have an idea of who's going to be on what roster, how this is all going to look. For the most part, there are still some teams with a couple of open roster spots, and they're still trying to figure out what that's going to look like and who's going to fill those spots. But the big news that came out just late last week was USF picking up Dayton transfer Mike Sharavjamts. I'm sure I'm actually butchering his name, but he's a former ESPN 100 recruit, 6'8" point guard, nicknamed Mongolian Mike. And from all accounts, he's looking forward to coming to San Francisco because of the large Asian community there and to be part of that there in the city. So, again, this is kind of like he is now the big component of what USF has done in the offseason. I felt like USF coming into the week and going into the interview I had with Coach Gerlefsen that they had a solid offseason, but I wasn't sure like if they had found that guy or how they were going to rebound from losing not only Khalil Shabazz but also Robert. So this was a team that did lose quite a bit. You also lose Zane Meeks, Julian Rishwain transfers out. So there was a lot of pieces that they needed to figure out how they were going to balance that out. But they bring in Malik Thomas from USC. They bring in Stefan Todorovic from SMU, not a wing shooter. So they're adding pieces. And this USF team is starting to, I think, look like a team that's going to, again, compete for that top half of the WCC. Obviously, the WCC is going to look very different next year without BYU. Even though BYU finished fifth the last couple of years, we always had them in the conversation to be that third team. And obviously for the longest time, BYU was that third team in the WCC. And now we're starting to figure out who is going to be stepping into that consistent third team, the consistent team of who's going to be there right alongside Gonzaga, St. Mary's. And I think there's a number of cases obviously to be made recently. USF can make that case. They've had 6 20-win seasons over the last 7, the one being the pandemic year where they didn't. It could be Santa Clara. This is a team that is going to have back-to-back first-round NBA draft picks, or at least like back-to-back NBA draft picks. We'll see where Brandon Pajemski ends up falling. Or it could be LMU. LMU has finished third 2 of the last 3 years, 2 of the last 3 seasons. So that's another team that could actually fall into that category of stepping into that role as the consistent third. And so it's going to be really exciting to kind of see how a lot of these rosters are brand new. USF is going to look completely different. Santa Clara is going to look completely different. LMU, short of Kelly Lauopepe, is going to look very different than they did a year ago. Gonzaga is going to look very different than they did a year ago. Now, I will say for Gonzaga, the big thing for me is that in what we found out in the last few weeks as everyone had to make their final draft decisions is that Anton Watson was going to come back. And while he's not a quote addition to this team, this feels like a huge get to me. This is something that I think is going to really help Gonzaga early on because it maintain some of that continuity that Gonzaga usually has and was not going to have going into this year had he not actually returned. Because remember, you do lose Drew Timme, you do lose Julian Strother, you do lose Malachi Smith, you lose Rasheer Bolton, you lose Hunter Salas. You had a lot of essentially their top 7 guys short of Nolan Hickman were going to be gone had Anton Watson also joined them. So I think this was actually that move. While it didn't make waves, it didn't make a whole lot of headlines nationally or even throughout the WCC. That's a big deal that Anton Watson returns and comes back. And then obviously we can't overlook what Gonzaga has done otherwise. The fact that they add Graham Ike from Wyoming, they add Steel Venters from Eastern Washington. Ryan Nembhard obviously is the big one that everyone is going to point out. And that's the thing I felt Gonzaga was missing last year was that point guard play. And that's clearly going to be solved going into next year. But then some of these other teams, it feels like there are definitely the haves and then the have-nots in what's happened in the WCC so far. Because the portal was not kind to some of the other WCC schools. The portal was not kind to Pacific. The portal was not kind to Portland. The portal was not kind to Pepperdine. I mean, you think of some of the names that entered the portal and are not going to be coming back. The Mike Mitchell Jr. is not coming back. Mike Meadows not coming back. Moses Wood not coming back. Kalen Boone not coming back. Jordan Ivy Curry not coming back. Even Alden Applewhite, although he played more of a role position for Portland, I felt that's a huge blow for that team. Even Chance Stevens over at LMU, even though I feel like LMU did a much better job of replacing him. There's a lot that these teams, I feel, didn't do or weren't able to do. I'm not going to say didn't do, because obviously these coaching staffs are doing as much as they can to try to find guys and convince them to go to these schools. But it hasn't worked out this summer, at least to this point. I believe a few of those teams have some roster spots open, so we'll see how they start to fill in those gaps on that. But Portland, Pepperdine, Pacific, San Diego, this was a rough off season for those 4. I think it I think it's very clear that that's probably going to be the bottom tier of the conference, because they just, not only did some of those teams lose a lot, they didn't add, not in a significant way. San Diego is actually maybe the only one, if you really look at what they've done, they didn't actually go into the portal. They are bringing in essentially a freshman class that's going to be their future guys in a couple of years. They are bringing in a point guard, a shooting guard, small forward, power forward, center. They're bringing in a 5 from that freshman class that could potentially be those next guys. And that is unlike what the rest of the conference has tried to do, where the rest of the conference is trying to really take advantage of the portal and go that route. So San Diego also loses. They lost quite a bit, so it may be a couple of years before we really hear from San Diego again in a significant way. That middle tier, like USF, Santa Clara, and LMU, are just duking it out for who's going to be that third team. And honestly, with the talent that's been brought in, with what is starting to be pieced together schedule wise, it's going to be exciting with those 3. It's those 3, when they get up together, are going to be great matchups, I think, throughout the course of the year. It'll be exciting to see what they all do in the non-conference. But USF, Santa Clara, and LMU have all done great jobs trying to retool their rosters in the offseason. And if you want a little bit more of a breakdown on that, there is an article on busting brackets. Tristan Freeman, who's been on the show before, he did a breakdown and grading each of the off seasons that they've had to this point. It didn't include the Dayton transfers, and I think that does impact what USF's grade probably is now versus what it was a week ago. But again, check it out. He produces great stuff, so go ahead and check him out on Busting Brackets. All right. we're going to transition here a little bit and talk about some of the NCAA rule changes that have occurred that were announced just this past week. And the most significant of them, and I think this one is something everyone is going to be happy about, and I sure am one of those, is that we're getting changes to the block charge. And so the what the NCAA put out read as follows. So the changes to the block charge rule. The defender has to be in position to draw a charge at the time an offensive player plants a foot to go airborne to attempt the field goal. If the defender arrives after the offensive player plants a foot to launch toward the basket, officials will be instructed to call a block when contact occurs between the two players. Previously, defenders had to be in position to draw a charge before the offensive player went airborne. So this rule change is long overdue. I think I and almost every college basketball fan knows that there were way too many charge calls being called in the sport. That there were way too many times that you had defenders slipping in right underneath an offensive player as they've already planted that foot and are launching upward. Not in the air yet, but they've already started launching. And that is a safety issue. That is not really being a good defender. That is just taking advantage of a poorly written rule. And the rule has now been changed. So hopefully we see less of that going into next year. And I think this just helps the game all the way around. I don't think there's you should have any issue with this rule change. This is one that should just help the sport and help game flow, help safety, every box that's checked. This should have been done a long time ago, but it's finally being done, and this is a good thing. So a few other rules that are also changing for this coming season. One of which is the resetting of the shot clock on an offensive rebound in the front court. Shot clock will be reset to 20. So again, we're speeding up the game a little bit more. We're going to have more offense in the game. So I think that's a good thing. I think we need to speed up the play a little bit more to add to that entertainment value, add to the athleticism of the sport. There's so many good athletes. Let's take advantage of that fact. Now, one that I saw this rule written and I scoffed. I think I'm not a fan of this next one. And it's the fact that if a player is airborne, and they call a timeout, they will be granted said timeout. And the example of this is someone grabs a rebound, they're falling out of bounds, and before they can touch the ground, they call a timeout. That timeout will be granted. The fact that they use that example, and of course that's because that's the example everyone's going to go to, man, that's lame. This does not feel like it helps the game in any way. The changes to the block charge rule make sense. Like, that helps the game. I don't see how that rule helps the game, because body control is part of it. Body control is why there was always the problem with block charge. And this is a body control issue, maybe a momentum issue. But again, it's like, you should be able to stay in bounds. And if you're falling out of bounds, you should not be bailed out in that way. At least I don't think you should. I'm not like angry about this, but I'm like, come on, man. Like, this one just does not make a whole lot of sense. And then another one is another rule change. If a player commits 3 flagrant ones in a game, they will be DQ'd. Right now, the rule is 2. Why are we going to 3? This one also doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Maybe I need it explained to me why 3 is necessary. I feel like after you've gotten the first, you should have gotten the message that what you did was wrong. I don't understand why you need a third or essentially another step of like, oh, I made a mistake, I shouldn't do that. I don't understand that at all. And this is one that I think more like super college basketball people know that this was a thing, but maybe the casual eye actually didn't quite notice it. Like you knew it, but you didn't quite know it. So now players will be allowed to wear numbers 0 through 99. And it may sound like, well, weren't they allowed to do that before? Actually, no. If you notice that like that players only had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on in the two numbers this way, so referees could go 1, 5, or they go 3, 2. Easier for referees to do it that way when they're calling fouls or anything else. And now they'll be allowed to wear 0 through 99. So it'll be interesting to see what new number combinations we start to see out there. I mean, basketball uniform numbers don't typically end up being ridiculously large numbers. You don't see football numbers all that often in basketball, even at the NBA level. They can have them, but they don't. So it'll be interesting to see how many people actually do take advantage of these larger numbers, if they do at all. And yeah, it's again, we're going to strip away the easy things that shouldn't have been a thing to begin with. So if you start seeing 73s or 77s or 65s or 98s, this is why. That's that. So the rule change, that's what's happening in college basketball for next year. A lot of rule changes again. The biggest one being charges are going to be pulled back a lot more. So the player will get, once that plant foot lands as they're going to launch, that is now the point in which it will become a block and no longer a charge. And nothing but good for the game. All right. So the NBA draft is only a couple weeks away, and we do know who is staying in the draft and who is not. We know that Max Lewis is in. We know that Brandon Pajemski is in. We know that Julian Strawther is staying in the draft. We know Drew Timme will also be part of it, as well as Malachi Smith, who chose to stay in the draft this year. And going through the draft analysts, a number of the mock drafts, just to kind of see where people are feeling the WCC guys, it's not terribly surprising to see where guys are drafted. So largely, for the most part, as we've kind of talked about throughout the course of the regular season and somewhat in the offseason, we kind of know and understand where Max Lewis, Pajemski, Strawther all kind of fit in. Timme fits in, and Malachi Smith fits in. So, to no surprise, Max Lewis is anywhere between like number 20 and number 31. Essentially, he's going to be a late first round pick. That's what Max Lewis will be. We know what he can do on the offensive end. He is a 3-level scorer. He can shoot from 3. He can get to the basket. He has a good mid-range game. The defense is the one thing that's maybe a little questionable, and it's not necessarily the skill level, it's commitment on that end. Pepperdine was one of the worst defensive teams in the country last year. He was part of that. That was a problem for Pepperdine for 2 years. And so I think, and now at the NBA level, I don't think it's going to be as much of an issue for Max Lewis. I think that what he's going to be asked to do is going to be kind of what he is, especially if he's going to be a late first round pick, that he's going to go to a team that is going to have a very specific use for him. So that I think he's going to land in a pretty good spot. I did see a couple of the picks were at number 23, and number 23 is actually Portland. So that would be an interesting actually landing spot for Max Lewis. He would remain within the WCC and the West Coast geographic footprint. And I think that's That'd be a good landing spot for him if he ended up in Portland. Next, kind of on this list is going to be Brandon Pajemski. We know obviously he's not as athletic as some of the other guys, but one of the things that he does, it's like he is a worker. He's going to get his numbers. He's going to play hard on both ends of the floor. He has great vision. He does a lot of the little things well that you want a potential point guard to do. Now, I think this is where it's going to get interesting because he's going to be a little bit of a tweener at the next level. He has point guard vision. He may not have point guard quickness, but we also know that he can light it up and he can score. We know he can score at the basket. He finishes well. We know he shoots well from three. He knows how to get contact. He knows how to get to the line. He's going to do all the little things well. He's going to put in the effort. And I've seen him as high as 21 and as low as 34. He's definitely looks like he's a little bit more of a borderline first round pick. Some boards have him in the first round, some have him in the early second. So he's probably going to fall somewhere late in that first round. I think he's going to stay in the first round. I don't think he's going to slide to round 2. Someone's going to find enough value in him, especially for a team that's going to be looking for just 1 or 2 extra pieces to help them out. So Pajemski, definitely, I think that sounds about right to me. That late first round, he's not going to rise like Jalen Williams did a year ago. That's not going to happen. But he's already proven very much in all of these sessions and everything else that he's going to have a lot of value at the next level. All right, the next is Julian Strawther. And he's an interesting case because I have seen him as high as 28, but for the most part, he's a second rounder and a mid-second rounder. Outside of that one first round selection, I've seen 40, 42, 46. So I think that's probably about where he's going to land, which sounds about right. He's not an athlete that jumps off your screen. He's a very good three-point shooter. We know that. We know he's a clutch three-point shooter. We've seen that time and time again. But the one thing we saw throughout the course of the year was whether or not Strawther could bring it night in and night out. And that's a lot of times the difference between a first and a second rounder. He has all the talent. He has all the skills there. It's whether or not that consistency can be there on a regular basis. Now, I don't think Julian Strawther would be going into the NBA and potentially being a star. I see him as a role player anyway at that level. And I think he could be a good role player at the next level, at the NBA level. If he ends up with the right team, if he lands on the right spot in the right system, and they use him properly. And that's true of almost everybody. Like you have to use the player properly. You have to use their skill set in the right way. Make sure that they fit what you're trying to do. The worst thing that you can do, and we see it, teams do this all the time, is try to fit the square peg in the round hole. And they try to make a player fit in to a space that isn't who they are. And it never works. Or you take away really what they did well. So I think that's about right for Strawther. I think it actually puts less pressure on him so that he could potentially develop a little bit more if he's in that mid-second round. I gotta take a look back at the draft and kind of see who's landing in those spots. But I could see him being kind of like a lower level, maybe not like completely lower level, but like he and Corey Kispert are going to be very similar, I think, at the NBA level. I think there's a lot of similarities between those two. So if he has like a Corey Kispert type role in the NBA, I think that's going to fit Strawther pretty well. Now the two who really have not shown up on any boards, at least that I've come across, Drew Timme and Malachi Smith. And for Malachi Smith, that may not be surprising because because he's an older player, because he wasn't like the marquee 1A player, him not being on a draft board probably is not surprising. For Drew Timme, I don't think it's surprising either. Again, I have said it from the beginning. I don't think he's an NBA player, not because I don't think he's talented enough, but because what they ask big men to do in the NBA is not the skill set that Drew Timme has. They want your centers to be big, athletic rim protectors who also play above the rim on the offensive end. That is not Drew Timme. He would not fit on a lot of teams. Now, the one thing I will say, and maybe the NBA Finals is actually the case to be made for Drew Timme, is what we're seeing from Nikola Jokic and the performance that he is having for a guy who is not the most athletic, who is not the best defender, who is a premier passing center, maybe the best passing center we've ever seen. That guy might be the case to be made for Drew Timme. Not to say that Drew Timme is going to be Jokic. Far from it. That's not what I'm saying at all. But that type of player might be the case to be made that it still works in the NBA. That skill set, that sort of player can still work in the NBA. That a Drew Timme can work in the NBA. And but now it's finding that team who is willing to play that way, to play with play a little bit more deliberately. Drew Timme is not a liability on the defensive end, but he is not a great defender, which, I mean, there's also something to be said about, there's not a whole lot of great offensive centers in the NBA anyway. Like, outside of, once I get past Jokic, Embiid, Anthony Davis, who really isn't a 5, and then Bam Adebayo, it gets real thin real fast. So maybe there is more case to be made on that front, but it also does look like that he won't be drafted. That doesn't mean that he's probably not going to see Summer League action, because I almost guarantee we'll see Drew Timme in the Summer League in Vegas. And then it's a matter of, all right, where does he fall? Who is going to be the team who takes a chance and kind of sees how this could work? But you're going to have to find a team who plays a little bit slower, plays a little more deliberately, and because that might be the team that does it. Maybe it's a Utah, maybe it's a Milwaukee. Hell, maybe it's Denver, because they already have one of them. Let's see if we can actually expand upon this. There's going to be a team that's going to take a chance. I don't know if that means that he is going to be in the G League if he ends up overseas. I think what happens in Summer League is going to be a huge telling sign for his case. Obviously, we won't hear his name come up on draft night. That's not going to happen. But we will hear Max Lewis. We will hear Brandon Pajemski. We will hear Julian Strother's name called on draft night. The others, I think there's a good shot at Summer League. Maybe some of them end up on G League teams as undrafted free agents at some point. That might be the Logan Johnsons or someone like that. But I think that's about where we are. A couple weeks away. We'll see how this all plays out. The NBA draft is coming up. And as I start to wrap this up and we get closer and closer to the end of the summer, obviously we're still in the first month of summer, we're starting to see some schedules start to come out, which is always exciting to kind of see who's going to be playing who, what matchups are we starting to see. It's not one matchup, it's 3 matchups that we did get a full announcement on. Rocco Miller on Twitter, great college basketball reporter, bracketologist. If you're not already following him, go find him on Twitter and do so. We did get announcement of a 3-team event that's going to be taking place, or a 3-game event that's going to be taking place on December 16th in Phoenix, where it will be St. Mary's taking on UNLV as part of a triple header in the Jerry Colangelo Classic. along with Santa Clara taking on Washington State, and then Portland taking on Grand Canyon. So that's a great day of basketball, having that triple header. That's one I'm probably going to try to put on my calendar and try to make it out there. We'll see how that all goes. But as we start to get closer and closer, we're going to be talking more schedules. There'll be more interviews to actually check out. Again, reminder, check out the couple of interviews that are already up. Justin Joyner from St. Mary's, and then also Chris Gerlufsen from USF. Those are both already up on the podcast. There will be more coming out throughout the summer. And that will do it for this episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to follow me on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, @PostByZach. Subscribe on the YouTube channel. Do all the things. And so we'll be back at some point this week and the coming weeks with more episodes. So do all the things. Have a good week, everybody, and I will catch you later.